Dark Noon initially was not meant to be a piece about the Western, but it came out of rehearsal, out of the process, out of the thinking to say maybe this is the angle we should take, because it is not a piece that was pre-written and then we went into rehearsal to rehearse a thing that is preconceived. It could have been a bad Lion King.
So Dark Noon is, a retelling of the story of America's Wild West from an outsider's perspective. But Tue Biering has done other shows that are really about forcing audience members to confront their own prejudices. He's into very high levels of audience participation. And
that makes a chill run down my spine.
Yes, I know. I always sit well back at those shows. It's row S for me. But in Dark Noon, I think I have read that the audience sitting up the front almost become cast members. They're called upon to take part in a square dance. They're called upon, more controversially, to take part in a mock slave auction. And this is all part of the broader retelling of the settling of America's Wild West. The key roles are performed by mostly black South African actors in whiteface and bad blonde wigs. And so I asked Tue about that. I asked, are you being intentionally provocative there? Because obviously white actors in blackface these days is absolutely forbidden and for good reason. And he sort of sees it as the whiteface as a logical extension of reversing the conventions of the history and the storytelling and of the cowboy genre. In particular, its romanticised view of frontier history. They include Chinese people discriminated against during the gold rush. They include enslaved African Americans, and, of course, Native Americans. So he wanted to bring in the incendiary European immigration debate. And so that's why we have a South African cast.
By using a South African cast, obviously he brings a whole lot of other history into this story. What do you think that adds to this very multi-layered story?
The South African cast do tell their own stories at the end, and they take some of the sort of motifs that you see throughout the performance. So toy guns are going off all the time, for instance, and they talk about the role of gun violence during and after apartheid and their personal experiences of it.
Another layer that we're going to be adding to it at the Sydney Festival is Australian audiences watching this in a place where we have our own very complex history of violence, settlement, exploitation, conquest. Is there particular relevance, do you think, for an Australian audience?
Yes, in the sense that it is challenging that sort of Churchillian idea that it's the victors who get to tell and control the history. And so, of course, in Australia, there are parallels there with the history of Indigenous dispossession.
That's what the most famous American musical of the past decade did. Hamilton used a black and brown cast to tell the story of the American Revolutionary War and the Founding Fathers. Does this bring Hamilton to mind for you?
There are definite parallels there, and I guess it's part of a broader move in the arts and across society, really, where we're talking about giving, or there's a push on to give a greater range of people voices and a questioning of who gets to tell what stories. Of course, that can sometimes cross into censoriousness and political correctness, I feel, in that you have people saying, well, certain groups own these stories, and I don't agree with that. Hearing from voices that have been excluded or forgotten or marginalised, I think enriches the culture, and Hamilton is an example of that.
It's a movement that we're seeing play out in all sorts of different ways in the arts at the moment. So the new series of Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light, is going to include a much more diverse cast than the first season of Wolf Hall did. This is, of course, is the telling of the story of Thomas Cromwell, the senior advisor to Henry VIII in the Tudor court. What's your view, Rosie, about diversity in casting and how hung up we are on it and how hung up we should be?
I think it's been a revolutionary move and on the whole a good move. And every now and then there might be a context. I can think of an Australian TV drama, I won't name it, and, a rough outback town that years ago we would have characterised as a bit of a redneck town that sort of was presented as this multicultural paradise. Not paradise, but, a melting pot. And it just didn't ring true to me. On the other hand, I think when I watched Bridgerton, initially, I sat thinking, well, Pete, you have black people playing aristocrats here, but the reality is that black people were enslaved by these same aristocrats in America, if not in Britain at the time. Is that historical denialism a good thing? But on the whole, it's a fantasy. So I think at times it can seem a bit artificial and as if a formula is being followed. But mostly it's a really good thing. No James Bond film would work if we all sat there interpreting his talent for stunts, literally. If we didn't suspend our disbelief, we wouldn't enjoy it.
No, he manages to emerge from the sea in a wetsuit, unzip it and have a perfectly pressed dinner suit on underneath.
Yes.
His hair's perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It seems like a very fun show. For your job, you have to go and see a lot of performances. Do you get to see a lot of things that are fun right now, or are we in a bit more of a kind of serious, earnest mode in performing arts?
There maybe is a swing back to things that are kind of primarily, a good story. I think Melbourne Theatre Company has just recently extended the season of a comic adaptation of My Brilliant Career. I think theatre does go through phases where it simply takes itself too seriously, I think, and can seem a bit po-faced and off-putting to people. And I've been struck in recent years by the divergence between the great box office appeal of, say, a successful musical, which can run for years and years and years, and actually can extend the art form, as Hamilton did, and sometimes the struggle that the subsidised theatre has to, say, reach across generations.
Do you think subsidies for the arts push companies towards things that are dull but worthy because they don't have that commercial imperative to get huge numbers of ticket sales?
Most of them would argue these days that they do have that imperative, that the subsidies just don't go very far. And so you'll commonly hear statistics that the subsidies really only cover 20% of their expenses or account for 18% of overall revenue. So you hear that complaint from arts companies a lot. So they are quite reliant on box office. In fact, there are a lot of boxes I think they have to tick to get grants. And so there'll be, representation plays a role of different communities these days. There'll be expectations of gender equity, things, and there'll be expectations that there's so much Australian work, although theatre companies these days will tell you that audiences prefer to come to Australian shows than imported shows, which is a complete turnaround from the 80s and 90s. So, and I find that very intriguing. It's not as if they can just sit back and rely on their grants.